What's up, everyone? Welcome into DodgerHeads Live, presented by DodgerBlue.com, your home for the Los Angeles Dodgers. Still the 2020 World Series champions, still the champs. I'm joined by Matt Moreno, joined by Daniel Starkand. Guys, it's good to be with you together. We're going to be breaking down the top moments of the postseason, looking ahead to some things. But let me start with kind of a broad question. Matt, I'll start with you. It's been a few days. It probably feels like it's been a lot longer than that. But how are you feeling a few days post the Dodgers being eliminated from the playoffs?
Still kind of the same way. I feel bad for the team. Obviously, I know every team goes through injuries, and you could look at any other teams kind of left and say, well, they were missing so-and-so. But I think in the Dodgers case, to lose Kershaw and Muncy in the final weekend, then Justin Turner, I know he wasn't really hitting yet, but Justin Turner and Joe Kelly in the NLCS. Obviously, if you want to go back further into the regular season, I just feel like the Dodgers never really got a chance to throw their best punch in October. And now, and we're going to touch on it a little bit tonight and a little bit more in the weeks ahead. Who knows what this offseason will bring? The roster could look drastically different next year compared to what we've been used to.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating situation that the Dodgers find themselves in. Daniel, what about you? Now we're a few days removed. You've had some time to process. Obviously, you and I did a live show the night of. But where are you at with how everything played out?
I'd say I'm at peace at this point. Like Matt said, it just felt like there were a million mountains that this team had to climb, and yes, it would have been great if they climbed them all and repeated as champions and whatever. But they just ran into a really good team at the wrong time, and that happens in baseball. I'd say baseball more than any other sport. There's just so much randomness involved in the playoffs that I don't want to say not always the best team wins, but you never know what's going to happen. Any team is capable of winning. So, it sucks that, the season didn't end how the Dodgers had hoped, especially for the reasons Matt listed. We don't know which guys are going to be back and which guys aren't. So it would have been nice for them, that kind of group, to kind of at least go out with another championship, depending on who comes back and who doesn't. But at the end of the day, I'm at peace. And I'm honestly kind of excited to see what happens this offseason. I think the Dodgers are going to be involved in a lot of stuff, as they usually are in the winter. So I'm just kind of to see.
Yeah, Matt makes a good point when it comes to injuries. And I think the easy one is, well, the Braves were without Acuna. But it is worth noting that the Dodgers, the timing of their injuries was so brutal in the sense that they didn't have opportunities to replace Max Muncy or Clayton Kershaw. These were all injuries that took place after the trade deadline. And yes, of course, Justin Turner gets hurt and he wasn't playing very well. So I kind of don't necessarily include him in this conversation because I don't think, if we're being honest, he would have made a real difference in the same way that Muncy or Kershaw would have, just based on what could have been expected. But that's a big deal. But I'm with you, Daniel. There is a sense of peace. I think the biggest thing is, hey, the Dodgers won the World Series in 2020, and opposing fans can say whatever they want to about that World Series, but I've got a shirt that says 2020 World Series champion on it. I got a hat that says 2020 World Series champion on it. I never thought I'd see that day, and I did. And so I'm at peace with what happened. As you said, I've always said Major League Baseball playoffs are a crapshoot. That's why it's the most frustrating and most exhilarating sport, time of year when it comes to baseball, because even the best teams, even the Dodgers, who are 16 or 17 games better than the Braves in the regular season, it's like a 60-40. And if you play that out over the course of 6, or in this case, 6 or 7 games, there's no guarantee that the better team's going to win. In most cases, it's going to be very close. And as was the case with this one, I mean, you look back at some of the scores of these games. The Dodgers lost game 1 by 1 run. They lost game 2 by 1 run. They won game 3 by 1 run. Game 4 and Game 5 were both blowouts, but Game 6 was a 4-2 game. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, there were moments when that one felt pretty dang close. The Dodgers had a runner in scoring position to tie the game with nobody out and couldn't get to it. So, with that being said, Matt, are you watching the World Series? Do you care at all about this Braves versus Astros series?
I've had it on when I've been working, just kind of getting stuff done either for the day or for the next morning. I'm not really going out of my way to, sit down and actively seek it out. And I don't anticipate that changing. Maybe once it gets to kind of a deciding game, I guess I'll add the caveat. If the Braves are in position to close it out, I'll probably be a little bit more willing to say, hey, actually I want to watch this. If it's the Astros, then, whatever. We'll have to congratulate them on winning their first World Series in franchise history.
No, it's like they said, you actually don't have to congratulate them on anything. Somebody was like, "Hey, you have to feel good for Dusty Baker." I'm like, "No," and the Astros is like, "No, actually, believe it or not, you do not have to feel good or congratulate the Astros for anything." Daniel, for you, are you watching the World Series?
No, I haven't watched any of it. I will say though, I'm not rooting for the Braves, but I want them to win more than I expected, I guess. Like I thought I just wouldn't care. Like I don't really like the Braves too much either, if I'm being quite honest. But I will say, like, I would much rather they win than the Astros. But I'm not watching any of it. Maybe like Matt said, like if it gets to a clinching game, maybe I'll flip it on. But there's a lot of other sports, a lot of other things in life going on right now. I don't really care to watch those two teams.
No World
play in the
Series
World
for
Series.
me. I mean, there's so many other sports and teams that I follow that when it comes to baseball games that don't involve the Los Angeles Dodgers, I find it really hard to care, especially 1 week after watching, as much baseball as I'll ever watch, which is like every single game for 3 straight weeks, it feels like. And so it's nice to get a little detox from baseball. And yet here we are. I mean, there's tons of news coming up. So here's the plan. Tonight, we're going to do a postseason kind of recap, going over the top plays of this past postseason. And then in the weeks ahead, the next week or so, we're going to do a ton of stuff. We're going to break down some comments Dave Roberts made in his show tomorrow. We're going to have some free agency previews. Corey Seeger, Chris Taylor, Clayton Kershaw, Max Scherzer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of big names for the Dodgers on that front. And all that stuff's going to be happening 5 days after the World Series is the deadline for basically if the Dodgers want to re-sign any of these guys, they have until then. There's some 40-man roster decisions. So that's the plan for the future. But guys, let's jump into the postseason recap. This started out as an exercise. We say, hey, let's talk about the 5 biggest moments. Now, as we go down this list, you'll note this is not the best moments. Okay, this is the biggest moments. That'll give you a hint of some things that are to come. But we started with 5. We ended up with 7. 7's a nice round number, so we'll go with 7. And I'm going to work backwards, starting with the 7th most significant moment of the postseason. Now, this is my list. We talked briefly about my list. You guys disagreed with some of the order, but I couldn't figure out how to do anything about that, so we just stuck with my list. And where you guys disagree, you guys can disagree. Number 7, I don't think we have much disagreement until we get to like the top 5. So we'll start with number 7, which I think we all agreed upon, which was kind of a combination of the NLCS Game 5 and the performances we saw from Chris Taylor and AJ Pollock. Those two guys combined for 5 home runs in a game the Dodgers win 11-2. Pollock 3 for 5 with 4 RBIs, 3 runs scored. Chris Taylor 4 for 5 with 3 runs scored and 6 RBIs. Again, 5 home runs and 10 RBIs between them, 6 runs in total. Daniel, I'll start with you. In this moment, number 7 seems fair to you, but what will you remember about NLCS Game 5 and the Dodgers beating the Braves 11-2?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say this was the funnest game of the postseason, the least stressful. I mean, the Dodgers hit 5 or 6 home runs. Pollock and Taylor alone hit 5 between them. And I'd say I was just very happy for those two guys specifically. Yeah. Like Chris Taylor is a guy who has been great for the Dodgers since he came over, and he was an all-star this year, but he did struggle at the end of the year, and he was actually out of the lineup like in the wild card game and NLDS Game 1. And then go figure, he winds up being the team's best player in the postseason pretty much. And that was the game of his life right there. 3 home runs. Not too many moments like that. And then Pollock is a guy who has taken his fair share of criticism for his postseason struggles. So, and I feel like he kind of put those to bed with a really strong postseason. So I was really happy for those guys. And to me, that game was the most enjoyable all October.
Yeah, it was funny because as you say that, I'm remembering back to the wild card game, and AJ Pollock was taken out of that game, I believe. And I was highly critical of that decision. And people were like, Pollock sucks. He's a bum in the postseason, which turned out to be a fairly accurate narrative for a week. But I feel like as the NLCS wore on, he definitely hit his stride. As we'll talk about, he's involved in a couple of these moments. Matt, 3 home runs for Chris Taylor, 2 for AJ Pollock. Of course, they win this game to extend the series. They win 11-2. It was one of the few games where it felt like the Dodgers offense actually got going, which was nice for a change.
Yeah, definitely. Although I will say the first, I don't remember, maybe 2 or 3 innings of that game, it was close, right? And they were trailing, I think. So it was a little stressful. Going into that night, I thought, the Dodgers will show some fight. They're not going to let the Braves kind of eliminate them and close it out at Dodger Stadium. And if I remember correctly, it wasn't really trending in that direction. And then Chris Taylor hit his first home run.
They were down 2-0. They gave up 2 runs. Freddie Freeman hit a 2-run home run in the top of the first inning. And then the Dodgers kind of started climbing back in it. Pollock got his first home run, and Taylor got his first home run in the second. And then from there, it was 3-2 after 2, and they just kept tacking on. But it was, to your point, I mean, the Dodgers at that point, they were down, they're back against the wall, and they give up a 2-run home run in the first inning. So pretty significant moment.
Yeah, I think that's what it was. It definitely sucked the air out of the stadium. And then, like Daniel just said, to see those two guys specifically have that night was entertaining. And, just kind of looking beyond, obviously, the significance of the Dodgers staying alive. Yeah. Credit to AJ Pollock. He struggled in the postseason again, but he didn't let it affect him, I guess, if you will. He constantly was saying the right things. Then he went out and actually lived it. Like, they needed production from him, and he provided it for them. Just like he said, his focus was just on always being ready, whether he's in the lineup or coming off the bench. He'd be ready for whatever Dave Roberts needed.
Yeah. And I mean, Pollock, 33 years old. It was nice to just see him. I mean, and going back to, as I said, it felt like picked it up. I mean, he finished the postseason. What do you think? Well, actually, Daniel, I'll ask you. What do you think AJ Pollock's batting average OPS was for the postseason this year?
I know it was good. He hit like 300 with like an 860 OPS or something like that, I want to say, because a 2 home run game in a small sample size will help out with that a lot. But he also came up big in the game 6 as well, drove in that in that 7th inning. He had that double, so he ended up pretty well.
Yeah.
So I was happy for him.
314 batting average, 933 OPS. He had a 600 slug. Wow. And I mean, to keep this in mind, he was 2 for 13 in the first 4 games of the postseason. He doesn't play in one of those games. Comes back in game 5. He goes 1 for 1 with a pinch hit. Comes back in the Brave series. He goes 1 for 4, 0 for 4, 1 for 2, 1 for 2 with 3 for 5 and 2 for 4. So closes it out on a hot streak. So for a guy who's struggled historically in the postseason, that was encouraging to see. Let's move ahead to moment number 6. As we said, some people saying, are these good moments or bad moments? The answer is yes to that question, because the sixth biggest moment in the postseason, as far as Jeff was concerned for the Dodgers, was the 7th inning of Game 6 in the NLCS. This is a game where, again, the Dodgers have their backs against the wall. They're down 3-2 in the series. They're down 4-1 in the game. Chris Taylor leads off the inning with a double. Cody Bellinger walks. AJ Pollock doubles to put the score at 4-2 with nobody out. The tying run is now in scoring position. You've got Albert Pujols in against a lefty. You've got a pinch hitting opportunity, and then you've got Mookie Betts, so you're feeling good about how this scenario plays out. Well, not so much. Pujols sees 4 pitches and strikes out. Souza sees 4 pitches and strikes out. Mookie Betts sees 3 pitches and strikes out. Those 9 strikes were 3 of the swinging variety, 1 of the foul-off variety, and 5 strikes looking with the tying run in scoring position. Matt, this is one that was tough to swallow. I don't know if we had gotten full hope that the Dodgers could actually really come back and win this series, but in a moment you get your hopes up. They score a run. The tying run's at second base with nobody else. You got Pujols against a lefty. You got Mookie Betts, and nothing.
Yeah, that was just a brutal moment, and I have it at 5th on my list. And just to give the viewers a little background on the discussions we had. Yeah, that game was tough. I mean, it felt, the Dodgers were trailing, and if they were down by 1 run or down by 2 runs, it always felt like double because the offense had just been struggling really the entire postseason. But then they kind of started to get some traction, and you thought, okay, like this is the moment, right? Like there's guys on base and there's nobody out. Even if Pujols, he didn't even need a hit. He just had to get it in the air. Just get it to the outfield, do something. Souza, I had much more tempered expectations for him. Frankly, I mean, I think this kind of just speaks to where the Dodgers were. Everybody talks about their depth, and yes, they had it, but they also didn't have it. Yeah. Like they had depth throughout their starting lineup, but then once you got to the bench all season long, and I've talked about it on here, you guys have talked about it, like it just dropped off, especially compared to last year.
Yeah, signing
Souza. Souza was a little expected.
Yeah.
The Mookie one is, I think, what hurt the most.
Yeah.
We've seen him attack the first pitch before. I was surprised that he took that good of a first pitch.
Yeah. Not alone.
I was floored that he took that same pitch for strike 2, or maybe he swung.
No, I think it was two looking and swinging on strike 3.
Okay, so like just the whole sequence was I don't know, that that to me, then once that happened, I thought, okay, like this just isn't going to be in the cards for
Yeah,
them.
Jason Austin says this is the biggest moment of the postseason for him, Daniel. Where does it rank in your top 7?
I think I had it like 4th or 5th too. I don't know if I'm putting it as the number one, because even if they do come back and tie it there or whatever, like you still got a long way to go. Like who knows who would have pitched Game 7 for the Dodgers. So it's like if this was Game 7, then maybe I would have, I would put it higher on the list. But it was only Game 6. But to me, this was kind of similar to Matt. This was the moment where I just kind of realized, like, oh, like this isn't happening this year. Like I had hope until then. Like I knew this Dodgers team, they never quit. They always fight back. But then once that happens, I was like, all right, it's over. It was just really deflating, and honestly, it was like kind of confusing more than anything, because like you said, they were just taking fastballs right down the middle. And I know Matzik is good. He throws hard, but it was just kind of puzzling. It was like, why are these guys not swinging the bat right now? I'm like Matt. I had no hope for Souza, but I mean, Pujols against the lefty, you think maybe he could hit a fly ball. And then of course, Mookie, you hope he could at least put a ball in play, and maybe, his speed, if he hits the ball on the ground, his speed could beat something out, or obviously he's a great hitter, so you think he could come through in a situation like that. But that was probably the worst at bat I've ever seen Mookie take. Just to stare at 2 fastballs and then swing through one. He just looked like he had no clue what happened either. So that moment sucked. It was definitely a big, obviously it was kind of the final stand, right?
Yeah.
So but I don't know if I'm putting it all the way up to 1.
Yeah, I mean, and Pujols is one of those guys where there's certain players on the team that you just feel good about at least their ability to put the ball in play. And Pujols is one of those guys. I mean, Trey Turner, we know the stats. As bad as he was in the postseason, he's like the best 2-strike hitter in all of baseball. Mookie Betts is one of those guys. Those are 3 guys that you just feel like, and obviously Trey Turner didn't have an at-bat here, but they feel like the types of guys where you're like, all right, at least we can put the ball in play. Now, Mookie Betts 2 outs, so it's kind of like putting the ball in play with 2 outs is better than striking out, obviously, but it doesn't do, like Pujols grounds out, we score a run. Pujols puts a ball in the outfield, we score a run. Pujols singles, we scored 2 runs, but none of those guys could do any of those things. And so I'm with, like you said, Daniel, that was the deflating moment. That was oh man, we're actually going to lose this right now. This is about to happen. And that's exactly what happened. So moving up to number 5 on this list. On my list, this is where we get our other not positive moment of the postseason. This goes back to Game 2 of the NLCS and the decision to input Julio Urias into the game. Scherzer started in that game. He could only give them 4 1/3 innings, and I'm trying to remember why Scherzer could only give them 4 1/3 innings. Oh, that's right, because he had come in as a relief pitcher in a previous game, and a normal bullpen session turned out not to be a normal bullpen session. So Scherzer comes out with 4 1/3. Vesia comes in with a runner on, gets out of the inning. Joe Kelly, 1-2-3 inning, 12 pitches. Blake Trinan, 1-2-3 inning, 9 pitches. Julio Urias comes into a game with 2-run lead in the 8th inning to bridge the gap to get to Kenley Jansen. His inning looks like single, flyout, single, double. That's the tie game from Austin Riley, and then strikeout, strikeout. They never get to Jansen because by the time Jansen were to come into this game Gratterall comes in for the 9th, and the Braves win in the 9th inning. An absolutely brutal decision there. And there's a ton of layers to this, right? Obviously, the first layer is they burn Julio Urias, the relief pitcher, and he loses the game. Of note, Joe Kelly, 12 pitches in his 1-2-3 inning. His season high this year was 29 pitches. Blake Trinan in the 7th inning, 1-2-3 inning on 9 pitches. His season high was 32. That was actually in a postseason game this postseason. Ultimately, they go to Urias. Not only does he lose the game for them, blow the lead there, but then you get the double whammy. He comes back in Game 4. He allows 2 runs in the 2nd inning, 2 runs in the 3rd on just 2 days rest. 3 days later, he comes into that game. And that absolutely sends the Dodgers into a tailspin. For a moment, you thought you had Urias, Scherzer, and Buehler all on normal rest and say, okay, even if the Dodgers are down 2-1, whatever, we're feeling good. Instead, they blow this one in Game 2, and then they go forward. They don't have Urias. Obviously, Scherzer turns out to be a whole nother story. This one's the most fascinating to me because of all the ways it played out. We're going to talk in a moment, spoiler alert, about Max Scherzer and the decision to use him in relief. At least that one had a positive outcome attached to it. This one had 2 negative ones. Matt, I'll come to you first. I mean, a week and a half later, do you have any more clarity on what the heck the Dodgers were doing in this moment?
Not too much. I mean, I get like it's complex, right? Because I don't think every scenario of a starter appearing out of the bullpen, like I don't think there's one blanket approach that can be taken or should be
Yeah.
taken. Um, that being said, I am of the belief that I would not have my starter come out of the bullpen before he's made his first start in that series. So if it had been reversed and he started game 2 and then they're asking him to pitch out of the bullpen in game 5 or 6, I can live with that. I think you kind of set yourself up a little bit for failure down the line with having him pitch out of the bullpen
Yeah.
first before getting a chance. And then, so even if fine, like and I feel that way even had it worked out in game
Yeah.
2 or game 4. So I didn't really agree with it in game 2, just like I said, from my own personal philosophy. Then I was surprised that, I mean, I guess some of it could have been just circumstances, but I was surprised that they then had him start in game
Yeah.
4. I thought for sure they would give him the extra rest because, you were going to need a bullpen game anyway. I think if you go and look at each individual relief pitcher, maybe, to see who was where in terms of usage, like they might have been backed into this position of having to use Julio out of the bullpen in game 2. I would argue that you kind of set yourself up for that by your plan in game 5 of the DS, and I know we'll get into that. But yeah, I mean, this one I definitely still scratch my head, and I frankly, like, I won't ever
Yeah.
necessarily understand or agree with it, and that is independent of how it ultimately shook out that night and the days
Yeah, real
after.
quick, Matt, a follow-up for you. I'm curious. It seems plausible to me looking back now that the Dodgers knew by the time they went to Urias in game 4 that it's possible that, is it possible that they knew about Scherzer's availability in game 6? Although, as I'm saying that out loud, my guess would be they would have gone bullpen game in game 4. They would have started Urias in game 5 to split up the 2 bullpen games, but instead they go Urias in game 4 on weird rest, and then they end up having to go back-to-back bullpen games in 5 and 6. So let me answer my own question before I pass that to you. But if they knew Scherzer was unavailable, I assume then they would have put Urias in game 5, right, Matt?
Probably. My guess is I think they knew something was up with Scherzer from the standpoint of it was obvious, at least to himself and internally, they didn't disclose it until, game 6, that he wasn't recovering at the normal rate that he is used to. I think the caveat to that is he kept expecting, oh, okay, the next day, like, I'll be fine. I just need to get through one more day. And that day just kind of kept getting pushed back.
Daniel, what do you think? What, I mean, I'll ask you the same question I asked Matt. A week and a half later, does this decision, is there any defense in your estimation of how this thing played out?
No, to me, this is the most indefensible decision in the whole postseason, and we'll get into, some other decisions that might have been indefensible as well. But to me, this was the worst. And if you want to, there's no one moment or one reason a team ever loses a series, but I'd say this was
close,
the biggest probably for the Braves series specifically, because not only it had an effect on 2 games, and 2 games the Dodgers lost. Like, not only do you bring in Julio and he blows it in game 2, which you have a 2-run lead, you have a great bullpen, you laid out how many pitches they had all thrown. No one was overworked. Gratterall was a guy who we saw throughout the course of the postseason was lights out, and he hadn't pitched at that point. So, like, even if you didn't want to go back to Treinen for another inning, or if you didn't want to go to Kenley for 4 or 5 outs, that was a guy you could have thrown in there, and he showed all postseason that he could get the job done. So to me, this was just kind of like Matt said, like with the thought that Julio's going to start another game down the line, like they kind of sabotage that start just to go after this game, and you get burned by losing that game, and then Julio, looks like crap in his start, and you lose that game too, and then you're down 3-1, and the series is all but over. So to me, I know Julio has been great out of the bullpen in the past. Like, usually he comes through in a situation like that, but to me, they had plenty of resources to get through that game without using him. And just the thought of this is only the NLCS, like, we still got so much to go. I think they just kind of let all their bullets fly a little too early, and it cost
It's
them.
crazy to think the Dodgers had a 2-run lead in the 8th inning of game 2 of the NLCS. And look, we're not going to sit here and play the what if game all night and say, well, if this happens, this happens. But it's just crazy to think that if they go to the bullpen, that ends up having an unbelievable record. Like, if you take out the starting pitchers who pitched in relief and just look at the bullpen's performance, they were unbelievable all postseason. If they were somehow able to come out of the win with a win in game 2, it'd be fascinating. Matt, I'm going to come back, or excuse me, Daniel, I'm going to come back to you. Andrew Friedman had a quote in his press conference. He was asked specifically I shouldn't say specifically. He was basically asked, how much of the in-game decisions are you involved with? And he said something along the lines of, we come up with our plan beforehand, but as far as what happens in the game, that's decided in the clubhouse. Am I reading too much into it to say, is it possible that he's distancing himself a little bit? Because look, we know that the plan to have Urias available in the bullpen in that game was something Andrew Friedman and the front office was clearly on board with.
Right.
But I think one thing you and I talked about, I believe we did the post-game show that night, was yes, having Julio available is one thing, but watching how this thing plays out and how good Kelly looked and how good Trinan looked and how good Vesia was able to get out his inning, like that in that moment to still go to Urias felt like a predetermined decision that was irrelevant. Do you think there's any chance that that was Friedman distancing himself from a decision like this one, or am I looking way too much into this because I want to blame everyone but Andrew Friedman for anything that goes wrong with the Dodgers?
Well, I mean, Friedman pretty much said it. Like, yes, you could like script out a game or like talk through how you want it to go, but at the end of the day, you have no clue how these games are like actually gonna play out. Like, they could play out a million different ways. So, yes, they probably talked before the game, like, hey, if we have a lead late, we know the Braves have all those lefties at the top of their lineup. Like, if Vesia's already used, like, we have Julio ready and available. He wants to pitch. Obviously, he's a competitor, so he's not going to say no to that. So we like him in that spot. But at the end of the day, like you said, you know, the way the game was playing out, I think, you know, it's up to the manager at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Like Friedman's not calling down and saying, hey, get Julio up or whatever. Like, once the game starts, I think that's what Friedman was saying. Like, once the game starts, it's on Dave and Mark Pryor and those guys. So I don't know if you want to call that like him distancing himself, him trying to make himself look good. I think everyone's responsible for the decisions are made. Like, if Andrew Friedman says before the game, hey, Julio's not available tonight unless this goes like 14 innings, then it doesn't, like, you know, Dave could make whatever decision he wants, but he's not going to Julio. So Friedman clearly didn't say that. So I think he deserves some responsibility here, but I also think at the end of the day, like, those decisions are made in the dugout once the game starts. And if Dave obviously wanted to go to Julio in that spot, and he did. Like, he could, if he didn't want to, he didn't have to. So I think to me, I think Dave deserves most of the blame, but I don't think Andrew Friedman is absolved from any blame there.
Yeah, because I mean, you and I said pregame, we hated the idea that he was going to be available at all. So like, we're not defending like, oh, we're fine with him being available, just not with him pitching. But I think it's easy. It's also fair to say it was made no sense for us that he was available. It made less sense watching how good Kelly looked and how good Trinan looked. And again, we talked about a postgame. This was a predetermined decision in the fifth inning when they went to Vesia to get out of the inning with the runner on in that spot. They could have gone to Brule there to save Vesia, knowing that the lefties were going to come back up later. They could have gone to Vesia. They could have gone to Brule instead of Urias. They could have kept Trinan in for the lefties. A lot of decisions. Matt, any comments you have? I mean, you were kind of, I believe, watching the Andrew Friedman press conference. Like, it felt like a moment where he could have made a more clear statement and didn't. What did you make of his answer?
Yeah, I was there for it, and I've been there. What comes to mind is 2019 and that whole debacle when the bullpen decisions were under the magnifying glass like they are now. And what Friedman told us, my days are yesterday or two, whenever it was, during his press conference for this year, obviously, was he basically reminded that he has said this in the past and he's had to answer questions in the past, and that pitching decisions are made in the dugout. That yes, like Daniel was alluding to, you know, there is planning. There is as much of, hey, if this scenario comes up, go to this. But like Friedman acknowledged, you know, the games could go any which way. You don't necessarily know. What struck me as different, and I will say he is in a little bit of a hard, between a rock and a hard place, right? Because you want to, the perception is that Dave Roberts is a puppet for the front office.
Yeah.
And I think Friedman is trying to prove that that is not the case, that Dave Roberts can make and does make his own decisions. But in doing so, like you alluded to, Jeff, it almost seems like he's throwing him under the bus.
Yeah. Or at least leaving the door open for him to fall out of the bus so that the bus could roll over him later.
Yeah, and I don't think that was his intention, but sitting there and how it was coming across, and sitting there in 2019 and how that came across, I interpreted it as two different messages, as this more feeling like, well, no, that was Dave Roberts' fault, as opposed to like explaining. And again, this is just my interpretation.
Yeah,
I don't think we'll get into this in our video tomorrow for everybody this weekend. I don't think there's going to be a change with Dave Roberts, but it definitely was interesting kind of how at least I took that.
Yeah, because he could have easily said, hey, look, you know what? We talked about it. Because I can't remember, Matt. Was that question specifically? I don't think it was specific to this particular decision. It was just more of a general question of, are pitching decisions made in the clubhouse?
Right. Yeah, it was more just how are pitching decisions made, and then with a little bit focused on using the starter side of the bullpen.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, it felt like a thing where it's like, hey, you know what? When you go to Julio, that was a decision that we made as a group before the game. And obviously it didn't work out. Like that's an easy decision. He has all the job security in the world, so he should have no issue accepting some level of blame for that. But that's not at all what he said. You know, he's like, yeah, you can make the best of plans. And look, exactly what we are criticizing is we don't understand the decision to have him available. We understand it infinitely less when you look at how the game's played out, which part of me, again, wants to imagine Andrew Friedman saying the same thing. Like, dude, trying to throw 9 pitches. He's one of the 5 or 10 best relievers in all of baseball this year. Throw him back out there. Don't go get your starting pitcher, you know. So anyways, unbelievable. But let's move on. We've got 4 more to talk about here. And the next one, you know, in some ways as controversial. Number 4 on my list, again, my list different than Matt's, different than Daniel's, was Max Scherzer closing out Game 5 of the NLDS. Now, this one's fascinating because some of these have been clearly good moments. Some of these have been clearly bad moments. This one is mostly good with a little bit of bad tucked into it. The good, the headline is this. The Dodgers were down 2-1 in the NLDS to the San Francisco Giants, facing elimination that would be unbearable for all Dodger fans across all time, anywhere. And yet, they come back and they win Game 4, and Max Scherzer comes in to close out Game 5. He comes into the game, he has to face Brandon Crawford, gets a lineup. He has to face Chris Bryant, who reaches on an error by Justin Turner. He has to face Lamont Wade Jr., or whatever the terrible nickname that they were spouting off about.
Late night
Oh
Lamont.
my gosh, it's the worst, one of the worst nicknames ever. But anyways, late night Lamont. Yeah, late night Lamont was in bed that night because while he almost hits a home run down right field, you know, it was a little past his bedtime this time. He ends up striking out. Flores strikes out on a clear check swing. Well, never mind. But Flores strikes out. The game is over. Max Scherzer closed out. It's a great moment, right? Because I will say this. When the starting pitcher comes in the relief role and succeeds, there is something special about that moment, especially in this one. As you said, Matt, this was a different situation because this was a loser goes home. If the Dodgers didn't win this game, then they had nothing. The context here was Urias give them 6 innings. So after we just crapped on Urias a little bit, we'll give him a shout out. He gave them 6 solid innings in NLDS Game 5.
Four innings.
4 innings, excuse me.
4.
Oh, that's right. Thank you. I was looking at the box score. I was like, man, that didn't look. He pitched into this. He finished the 6th. Let me rephrase. That's a better way of putting it.
Right.
He finishes the 6th. Trinan gets 1, 2, 3 in the 7th. Jansen gets 1, 2, 3 in the 8th. And then they go to Scherzer. So obviously you're looking at Trinan in the 7th, Jansen in the 8th. The decision was made once again at some point in this game that Max Scherzer was going to pitch. And he pitches really well. He gets the 3 outs. He actually gets 4 outs. Well, I guess 3.5, depending on what you want to count. Flores is out, but he had 2 strikes on the guy, so screw that. He's an out. So he gets 4 outs. It works. So on one hand, I say, you know what? Screw it. You beat the Giants. Whatever it costs you doesn't really matter because you beat the Giants and screw the Giants. On the flip side, Scherzer has dead arm in his next start. And that's the game where Urias has to come in because Scherzer can't get very far into it. And then Scherzer misses his next start after that in the NLCS. And so this one's a mixed bag of all mixed bags. I will definitively say I will not question this decision because screw the Giants. We beat the Giants. Could we have beaten the Giants with somebody else on the mound in the 9th inning? Yes, we could have. But I will never know for sure if we would have. And so I will just, whatever it cost me to beat the Giants, I was comfortable paying that bill a week or 2 weeks later. This was the heaviest price it could have possibly been. And yet, you know what? Screw the Giants. Daniel?
To me, I'll say this one was more defensible than the Urias one. You know, this one, it's a winner-take-all situation. You know, like you said, it is the Giants. Like, I was definitely able to stomach losing to the Braves a lot more than I would have to the Giants. That's for sure. So I think in that sense, it was like, all right, like they're going for it at least. Like they understand that we have to win this game. But with all that being said, like at the time, I still did not like the decision at all. To me, like if it's like the World Series or whatever, like I get it. Like, hey, let's go win this thing. But it's still the NLDS. Like there was so much baseball to be played at that point that to me the risk, it just wasn't worth it to me. And it kind of similar to the Julio thing. Like they had those other relievers, like Trinan and Kenley, were not overworked at all
12
by any
pitches
means.
for
Like
Trinan
I think
and
they
15
threw like
pitches for Jansen. Knebel and
Right.
Gratterall had already pitched, but Joe Kelly was
and
a guy that was available as well.
Right. And with once it got to Kenley, I understood it because his spot in the order came up in the top of the 9th inning, and they kind of wanted to add on more runs. So at that point, I understood it. But to me, Trinan had the 1-2-3 inning on 12 pitches against the bottom of the order, and then they decided not to trot him back out there for whatever reason. To me, I think. I don't know if Trinan goes a full 2 there, but he could at least get 1 or 2 more outs, and then you go to Kenley. You make a double switch and go to Kenley for 4 outs or whatever. Like, to me, there was a path to get through that game using only your relievers and not jeopardizing your starters in the future. So to me, I didn't like it, but I accepted it a little more just because, like you, it was the Giants, and I knew we had to win that game. But the risk was there. It wasn't like, oh, like, wow, like we never could have seen Scherzer's arm getting tired coming. Like, no, he's like, honestly, I know this is more defensible than the Julio one, but in this other sense, it kind of isn't, because at least Julio has done it before, and I think Scherzer's maybe done it like once or twice in his career, but that's something he's far less familiar with than Julio. But I'm kind of with, like, I'm going back and forth. It's good and bad. So I didn't like it, but they beat the Giants, so it's more.
Yeah, and this one's a little different because you do have Knebel and Gratterall who open the game, and then you go to Julio. So it wasn't like the Game 2 decision where it felt like your entire bullpen arsenal was available to you, and you chose Julio over all of these other options. This one, as you said, the way that it played out was slightly more defensible. Matt, if I give you a time machine and you can go back to NLDS Game 5 in the 9th inning, would you put Max Scherzer back in the game?
Knowing that they're going to get a win?
No, of course not, knowing they're going to get a win. Well, yeah, screw it. I'll put freaking Steven Souza on the mound if I know we're going to get a win. Right? Not knowing they're going to win.
I think I still probably do it. My biggest gripe with that decision was it seemed like they committed to using Max Scherzer almost no matter what. And that, to me, wasn't necessarily the right approach. I think if for whatever reason you needed to mix and match with your relievers a lot more than you expected, the game just got crazy, and now Max Scherzer is pretty much, the best option, the only best option available, I could understand that. So that's my biggest issue. Like Daniel said, Kenley's spot did come up in the order. I think it might have been at that point 6th or 7th when the top of the 9th started. But I think if you're a manager and if you're mapping out that game, Bob Guerin as well as the bench coach, like you need to kind of look at, well, what if we string together a couple hits and Kenley's spot comes up? So yes, at that point you did need to pinch hit for Kenley, but like I said, I think the Dodgers had already committed to using Scherzer almost no matter what, frankly, is what it sort of seemed like. So that's my biggest issue with that, is I felt like they were just, for a team and franchise and front office that touts itself as being nimble and flexible and able to adapt, like I felt like they locked themselves into that plan. Then I said that night, I did an appearance on NBC LA with Michael Duarte, and I said, if I'm the Dodgers now, I do not use Max Scherzer until a Game 3 of the NLCS. It just wasn't worth it. Like, these aren't bullpen sessions. Like, it's the 9th inning of a winner go home game, and so that is then my biggest issue with the whole Scherzer situation, as opposed to, just the literal decision.
Fair. Well, speaking of the top of the 9th, speaking of Kenley Jansen's spot coming up, number 3 on my list of most significant moments in the Dodgers postseason run was Cody Bellinger's go-ahead single in Game 5 of the NLDS. The top of the 9th, the Dodgers are tied. Camilo Doval is on the mound for the Giants. For some context for Doval, he had not allowed an earned run since May 15th this past season. He had been out of the major leagues for part of that time, but since being recalled September 5th, he had gone 17 1/3, no earned runs, just 10 base runners, and 22 strikeouts. He comes in for the top of the 9th. He gets Will Smith to ground out. Justin Turner draws a hit by pitch, a heroic hit by pitch by Justin Turner, given how he was hitting. Gavin Lux singles, and then Cody Bellinger on 1-2 count singles off of Doval. Now, we're going to forget for a moment that the Dodgers ended up stranding Lux at third after Chris Taylor's bunt attempt and Matt Beatty's ground out, but the Dodgers take a lead. And let's not forget, where Cody Bellinger was in this moment. He was 12 of 96 to end the regular season. He was just 2 for 14 in this particular series. And yet when the Dodgers needed it in Game 5, once again, Matt, Cody Bellinger comes up with the biggest hit imaginable. Now, this wasn't a walk-off. It wasn't that, but they go ahead. They get the ball in the mound. Because that's another piece of this, right? They went to Treinen in the 7th and Jansen in the 8th without the lead. I mean, they were all in on preserving things, and I liked the aggressiveness. You need to extend this game and not take for granted, well, let's try and save some of our arms for later. They just went for it and said, we'll figure it out later. They figured it out. But Cody Bellinger, 2 for 14 in the series, 12 for 96 to end the regular season against a guy who had not allowed an earned run since May 15th, and he absolutely comes up huge, Matt.
Yeah, I think out of the three of us, I'm probably the biggest Cody Bellinger apologist.
That's just because you didn't have to come on post game like 100 times this year.
I was defending him on a weekly basis this year, so
okay.
And I rostered him in my fantasy baseball league for the entire season. That should count for something.
Okay. Well,
I will not claim to be a Cody Bellinger apologist.
No,
okay, just to be clear, I was out on Cody Bellinger and felt very justified for about 90% of the season.
Okay, well, I'll settle for a tie with Daniel then. I obviously was doing the interviews when you guys were doing the post-game shows, unfortunately. I mean, it was expected, but not expected. Like I was on here, when we have fans commenting saying, hey, is he even going to be on the postseason roster type thing? Like,
come on.
Yes, he clearly was. And, I did believe that at some point he would come up with a big hit or a big home run. And obviously I didn't necessarily think it would be that specific moment, I'll be honest there. But I was happy to see it for him. I think it was a tough year going back to last offseason. Like, he's just been playing catch up, and then it ended up kind of propelling him through, the rest of the postseason at least through the Game 6 of NLCS when the Dodgers
Daniel,
were
this
still playing.
hitter off of that pitcher, it's absurd when you look back on it, right?
Yeah, this was the number one moment of the whole postseason on my list. You kind of laid it all out why, and not to mention like it's the Giants. Like that was the hit that sent home the Giants. Like, people forget that was a 1-1 game at the time. Like, there was not a lot of scoring in that game. Like, both teams were getting guys on base. No one could get the big hit, to bring someone home to take the lead. So it was kind of like, who's going to do it? Is it going to be one of our guys? Is it going to be one of their guys? And then of all people, for it to be Cody Bellinger, like after the season he had. And yes, like now looking back, he had a really good postseason. But like you said, at that time, he was 2 for 14. Like, he got on base in the wild card game a couple times. And then after that, he was kind of the same old Cody. So I was surprised that he got that hit. But at the same time, I wasn't, just because I know the talent is there. I know the work ethic is there. Like, I know he grinded through that whole season. And I don't believe in luck or whatever, but like sometimes the baseball gods are just on your side, and they like to reward guys who continue to grind. And to me, that was Cody Bellinger's moment. That was awesome. That sent home the Giants. Like you, I don't have to lay it out to you. You already laid out your hatred for the Giants, and that was the hit that sent them home. So to me, this was the number one moment. And that was it was just so cool seeing that stadium like go quiet. In shock, just because like another aspect, with the Doval thing, that guy was unhittable. Like, you don't expect him to give up that hit in that situation. And another part of it was like he could have, if he would have thrown like any other, like if he throws a fastball up, he probably gets him out easily. But he decided to go with the slider or whatever for whatever reason. And
Daniel
not
doesn't
allowed
believe
Cody
in
to
luck,
get a
but he
hit.
does believe in baseball gods for those keeping score at home. That's what we've got there. I mean, and look, the thing is I agree. I mean, this is a huge moment. To have it number 3 on my list says less about this moment and more about the 2 moments that follow it. And so I'll just jump straight to number 2, which honestly, this moment was the moment that I was highest on, that I think you guys seem to be lowest on when we compared our list. And that was Cody Bellinger's home run in Game 3 of the NLCS. Now, from a importance of the game moment, I'm not going to argue that a go-ahead run in Game 5 of the NLDS against the Giants versus a game-tying home run in Game 3 of the NLCS. Obviously, those two, as far as like importance to the overall season, are radically different. What jumps out to me about this one in particular was not only the unlikeliness, but the drama. I mean, this is literally a moment that I will never forget. And For me, game 5 is more about Max Scherzer closing it out. For me personally, that's what I'm going to remember. I'm not going to remember the Bellinger single as much. Whereas this moment, I'll remember, obviously, number 1, even more than that. But here's context for this one. Dodgers jump out to a 2-0 lead on the first 2 batters, but then go on to give up 5 consecutive runs. After the home run, the Dodgers go 3 for their next 23. That includes loading the bases in the first inning and Chris Taylor lining out. So they are 3 for 23. They are down 2-0 in the NLCS. I'm going to be honest. Bellinger came up in the 8th. It was probably like the 5th or 6th inning of this game. I knew at some point I was going to need to move from my house to my office to get ready for the post-game show. I just was like, forget it. I'm driving. I'm pissed. We're down 2-0. The offense is 2 for 18 with runners in scoring position the first 2 games. We strand the bases loaded. We're down 5-2. Like you said, Matt, 3 runs feels like 6 runs. It feels absolutely insurmountable at this point. And then everything shifts because Cody Bellinger comes up in the bottom of the 8th inning. He gets a 95-mile-an-hour fastball, chin high on a 1-2 count. And somehow, some way, this guy turns on that pitch and puts it 399 feet into right field, tying the game. It's one of the most dramatic, unbelievable moments I can remember, period, in any moment. So, Matt, I know this one was lower on your list, but talk about the moment and then maybe walk me through why it's lower on your list.
Well, I mean, at this point, I wasn't surprised.
Yeah,
It was just
exactly.
Cody Bellinger being Cody Bellinger.
Exactly
not
what you
Cody,
expected.
right? Yeah, I mean, I think at the time I didn't realize, from my perspective, watching the game, how bad
It was a great,
pitch it was.
bad pitch to swing at, great pitch to throw.
Right. Yeah, that's what I mean. But like Mookie implored Cody to tell everybody after the post game press conference, he drives a Benz too. Like, he's in the majors for a reason. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say, like, at that point I wasn't necessarily surprised that he came up with a big hit. That it was a home run, fine on that kind of pitch. Okay. For me, I had it lower just because going through putting my list together, like just how I kind of process things, and again, it could just be something personal, it's hard for me to rank, like, I almost went a little bit in sequential order, right? Like, we don't get to this Cody Bellinger home run without his base hit in game 5 of the NLDS. So to me, that's a bigger moment. And then I think we all agreed on the number 1 moment, and I'm sure some of our viewers have probably caught on what it will be. So that's kind of how I ended up putting mine together. And I mean, I think, I'll let Daniel take over from here, but really it was just, to me, another example of, what Cody Bellinger
game 3 of the
capable
NLCS,
of.
Daniel. Dodgers are down 5-2. They're 3 for their last 23. They were 1 for 18 with runners in scoring position in game 1-2. If you're being honest with yourself, in the bottom of the 8th inning, before Bellinger comes up, I mean, like, on a scale of 10, they're definitely going to win, and 0, there's a no chance they're going to win. You couldn't have been higher than like a 2 or a 3 at this point, right?
Yeah, this was the biggest moment in the playoffs in the sense that I went from being helpless to optimistic, like at the flip of the switch, more than any other moment. Because like they were, like you said, they were lifeless that whole game. They were about to go down 3-0. The series about to be over, and then one swing changes all that and gives them hope. But I think I had it lower on my list just because they ended up losing the series, so it's not as consequential as we thought at the time. Like if they come back and win the series and they're playing in the World Series right now, then this is probably the number 1 moment, just because you could pinpoint that as when things started to flip around. Kind of reminds me of last year, the Will Smith on Will Smith home run in game 5. Like that wasn't a walk-off, like that was in like the 5th inning or whatever, but that was kind of where you could pinpoint, like, things started to turn there, and then it went the Dodgers' way after that. I think if the Dodgers would have went on to win it all this season, we could have pinpointed this moment as that. But just because they didn't, to me, it's not as consequential as, him beating the Giants or the final moment, which we'll get to, which won the Dodgers a game. So this, yes, it was an awesome moment. Like, good for Cody again. But also, it tied the game. Like Mookie still had to win it after that. And then obviously they go on to lose the series, so it was kind of all for naught. But still a great moment that I'll remember, but just not quite the number 1 or even not number 2 for me.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, as you said, Chris Taylor reaches base in the very next at bat, and then Mookie Betts doubles him home. And so the Dodgers end up scoring 1 more run, which turns out to be the game-winning run in that one. So that leads to number 1, the most significant moment of the Dodgers postseason run. Matt, as you indicated, all three of us were unanimous on this one. It was a Chris Taylor home run in the wild card game. That game was tied 1-1 after the 4th inning home run from Justin Turner, which is crazy to think about how different our perception was of Justin Turner in that moment versus like it felt like he never got a hit the rest of the postseason after that. But the Dodgers are tied 1-1. It feels like the game is headed to extra innings as the Dodgers come up in the 9th. Albert Pujols lines out. Steven Souza lines out, makes some solid contact there. A little line out would have been nice a little bit later in the postseason.
For both of those
Steven.
guys.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. That game, we tie game 6 if we get 2 lineouts from them, but we don't. With 2 outs, Cody Bellinger walks. Chris Taylor gets a 2-1 pitch, hits it 420 feet to left field. I can't remember the exact stat, but it's one of the only walk-off home runs in a elimination, winner-take-all type scenario. Daniel, walk me through what you remember about that moment. Is Chris Taylor, again, we could go through the stats just like we did with Bellinger. He was terrible. I think 8 for 72 might have been the numbers prior to that one. 8 for 72. He comes into the game that he was not starting. He came in as a pinch hitter later in the game, gets a 2-1 pitch, puts it 420 feet to left field, and one of the most famous home runs in franchise history.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it doesn't get much better than that. Like a walk-off home run in a winner-take-all game. Like you said, Chris Taylor had been struggling, didn't even start in the game. So for him to have that moment was really cool. There's only been 4 walk-off home runs in Dodgers postseason history. Kirk Gibson, Justin Turner in 2017 against the Cubs. Max Muncy in the 18th inning against the Red Sox, and this one. So those moments don't happen very often. And we talked all season long like about how we're so scared of the wild card game just because we know the Dodgers are the better team. They will be the better team regardless of who they're playing. But in a one-game scenario, anything could happen. We know this offense was prone to droughts. And we saw it in this game. Like it was 1-1. Like they only scored on the Justin Turner home run. Like all of our fears were kind of starting to become a reality. Like, wow, they're really only going to score 1 run and their season's going to be over. But then Chris Taylor changes all that with 1 swing of the bat. So that was just an epic moment. I was glad, and it came against another team that I'm not too fond of, the Cardinals. Like I think it's kind of similar to the Giants. I wouldn't have been able to stomach losing to the Cardinals in this postseason, especially considering how much better we were than them. Like we're like 16 game innings or whatever it was. Like there was no reason the Dodgers should have been in that game in the first place. So just for them Chris Taylor to come through in that moment, that was just epic.
Matt, where does this one rank in kind of all-time Dodger moments that you can remember? Obviously, World Series victory aside, I mean, this has to be right behind a lot of the moments from the year before, right?
Yeah, it's definitely up there. I think kind of like what Daniel alluded to earlier with Cody Bellinger's home run, it sort of maybe unfairly gets penalized by the fact that the rest of the year didn't pan out the way the team obviously would have hoped. But it in a single moment, just in a vacuum, I mean, it's top 5 at least in postseason history, right? I mean, it's crazy. And I think, like Daniel said, that night was kind of turning out to be, everybody's worst nightmare was unfolding in front of our eyes. And frankly, I don't know if you guys remember, in the top of the 9th, there was that slicing fly ball to right field that ended up dropping foul. As Mookie kept running to go chase, I believe Mookie was still in right field. Whoever was playing right field at the time, I don't remember if there'd been a double switch or something, but as that right fielder was running to chase it, all I kept thinking was, it's the Cardinals, it's the postseason, this ball's going to land there, and that's how the Dodgers season is going to end. So to go from that landing foul and then, 10 minutes, 15 minutes later, whatever it was, for Chris Taylor to then have that huge moment, but not before my guy Cody Bellinger got on base and stole second. It was great, obviously, just all around. And like you said, there's no I think there was no debating what the number 1 moment was from this postseason, whether it is positive or just looking at kind of most impactful, because if that doesn't happen, who knows?
There's no other moments.
This would have been a short show. If Justin Turner's home run, number 1 moment, and adios, guys. See you. It's been a good one. We'll see you in a few days. Yeah. Well, good stuff. Definitely. There we go. We got a few minutes left. I know some folks have been firing questions off in the chat, so if you want to ask those, please do. Again, Daniel, Matt, myself, some combination of the 3 of us will be doing shows tomorrow on Dave Roberts. We've got some Chris Taylor, Corey Seeger, Max Scherzer, Clayton Kershaw content as well in the future, so stay tuned for that. But if you've got questions on this year, I see some people talking about, a lot of people already, of course, looking ahead to next year. PR I don't know. I'm not going to try and pronounce that. It looks like piranha, but misspelled. Scary question. Daniel, I'll come to you. Is Justin Turner done?
No, I don't think he's done at all. I mean, if you look at his overall numbers from the season, like he had a really good year, and I'm not gonna this was the first bad postseason he's had with the Dodgers. Like, if we're being honest, so I'm not gonna put too much weight into that. I think part of it was they went from playing a 60-game season to a 162-game season, and that's not really a grind you could prepare for. I mean, you do prepare for it, but you don't know how your body's gonna react. So I think maybe he just ran out of gas. He was dealing with some injuries late in the year, and then of course his hamstring gives out at the end there. So I still think Justin Turner's got plenty left in the tank. Like, that's a guy who could probably get out of bed and hit until he's like 40. So I think he'll be fine. I think with the expected addition of the DH in the NL, that'll keep him. He'll stay off his feet a lot more next season. So I think he's just fine. I think he's going to have another really
Matt,
good year
next year. I assume you agree with everything Daniel just said?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it unfortunately was just him, and a lot of other players just went into a slump.
Yeah, and I think, it's the question seems reasonable to me because Turner usually turns it on in the postseason. Usually that's the time in which he shines. And so he was great for the regular season. And as Daniel pointed out, we can't forget that. That's a much bigger sample size than 2.5 weeks. And he did have the home run in the wild card game. That Chris Taylor home run basically doesn't mean a whole lot, if not for Turner homering earlier. So I think with the DH coming, as Daniel said, he obviously he's under contract, so he's going to be around for a couple more years. But definitely I wouldn't say done. Matt, I'll come to you. This is something Daniel and I talked about. It's the single biggest question I think that the Dodgers face. Corey Seager, Jason wants to know. What do you say? Is Corey Seager back with the Dodgers next year, Matt? Okay.
I don't think so. I think the Dodgers are going to be aggressive in their bidding for him, but I think it might get to a point where they just will have to kind of bow out. And I don't want to get into the reasons why that may be the case, because it'll just probably anger everybody. But yeah, I don't.
Daniel,
I
had it 50-50. I can't remember. You were lower than that, right?
I also had it 50-50. He's one of the ones that it could go either way. I think, like Matt said, I think they will make an aggressive offer or whatever. But at the end of the day, like, Corey Seager is going to get paid a lot of money, and the Dodgers have a lot of free agents they're going to have to pay. So at a certain point, like, you can't just keep upping your offer. Like, there's got to be a line somewhere, and it'll just depend if maybe Seager wants to take a slightly less to stay with the Dodgers. Like, I think his post-game comments, he indicated he'd love to stay. So maybe that happens. But like, if a team like the Yankees goes out and offers him $300 million or something, I don't know if he could turn down that. I don't know if Scott Boras would let him turn down that, and I don't know if the Dodgers could get.
Laura wants to know, when will we have news on free agents? Kind of as I said, basically 5 days after the World Series ends is when guys officially become free agents. So up until that point, the Dodgers can still negotiate with Corey Seager, Max Scherzer, Clayton Kershaw, etc. But once 5 days hits, then they become free agents. Matt, I believe then guys can start signing immediately after that. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, technically free agency, quote unquote, starts the morning after the World Series, but the first 5 days is an exclusive window for teams to negotiate with their own free agents. Once that period ends, then players are free to sign anywhere. And what will be interesting to see, and I know we'll get into this as the season kind of unfolds, is how the potential lockout at the beginning of December might impact all this. Maybe some guys will look to sign early because they're worried about what the future may hold. Some guys might see it as the future CBA will be more favorable for players, so I'm going to hold out. So that's going to be another wrinkle.
Yeah, Daniel's been reading law textbooks, so he'll be up to speed on collective bargaining and all sorts of stuff once we get there.
We know how these things work in the offseason, though. Like, January, February could be rolling around, and a lot of these guys still might be signed. So I think patience is key here. Yeah.
Miles has a great question for each of us. Do you have a favorite regular season moment? We talked about the biggest, most significant postseason moments. Any favorite? I mean, mine was the 1+4. That sort of
game.
That
was a good one. I think I'd have to